Okay, so I missed one small thing while covering all these topics in the previous videos. You see, we only handle data locally in our app, so we never really came across a scenario where there's a backend server with APIs for these tasks. Normally, you would have a staging environment where you can run these tests without having to do anything extra. But what if you don't have any other environment except production? You can't pollute the production database with test data. An alternative would be to run your backend app locally, just like we do with our frontend app using the web server that we configured inside Playwright config. But what if you don't even have access to the backend app? What if it's handled by a separate team and gets hosted on a different machine? Now, in this scenario, you can simply mock the API responses. So when your frontend makes an API request to an endpoint, you can intercept this request in your test and provide your own mock response similar to an original response. It's pretty straightforward, so let's see how we can get this done. I've made a few changes to the app, so let me take you through them quickly. I've added a simple Express app inside this project directory itself, so I have this backend directory. All I did is went inside this directory and run pnpm init, that creates a node module, and I've installed Express and cors required for this application. All the application code is inside this file. It's pretty straightforward. I have this database here with one task in it, and I have three API endpoints here. One is for getting all the to-do items. The other one is to post or to add a new item to this list. And the third one is to delete the item. Very straightforward. The only changes that we have inside the front-end app, here I initially get all the to-do items from the database or from the backend server. The handle to do function is pretty much the same, but now instead of directly making the change to a state, I'm first making a request to the backend server. In the response of the server, I get the new items. So I am just replacing the state here with the items that I get from the response. Similarly, for the delete function, I make an API request to delete a specific to do item. And in response, I get the new items without the deleted item. To run the backend server, I'm using nodemon. So I have a separate script which basically runs this backend server. If I type in pnpm start, it's going to run nodemon app, and app is the server file that we have here. So I have the backend server running, I have the frontend app running. Everything is going to look more or less the same. The only difference is that now we are actually interacting with the backend server that is hosted locally. If I go to the network tab, you should see all the APIs here. Let me just reload this once. This is the get request, there's this delete request, and this should trigger the post request. So yeah, everything works as expected. Now let me shut down this backend server and then try to make the API request again. So now if I try to add something, this should not work. It should give me an error back because the backend server is not running. So essentially the frontend app makes the request, but the server is not running, so it will give me an error. This is what will happen when your test goes through the CI environment as well, and it tries to make an API request. Now what we'll do is simply intercept this request and mock the API response. So let's create a new test for this. I'll go inside my test file, and right below the login test, I'll create a new one. Let me just give it a random name. So I'll call it mock test, and this is going to be the same. So these are all the actions that we have in this new test. What it does is first it goes to this localhost domain. It will fill the username, it will fill the password, and then it will log in. It then fills the add to do input and clicks on the button to create a new to do item. And finally, it will just check if the new to do item that we just created, whether it exists on the page or not. This is pretty straightforward, nothing new here. Now we'll use a method that's available on this page fixture called route. So route helps you to modify the network requests that are made by the page. So what we are going to do is intercept the two requests. One is the to-dos request, which is the get request, and the other one is the add to-do request, which is a post request. When Playwright comes across one of these requests, it's going to replace the response with the custom response that we'll pass to it. That's how we are mocking the APIs. The way we pass the custom response is with the help of the fulfill method present on this route param. So let me show you what I mean by this. We are using this route method that's present on this page param, and whenever we come across this endpoint, all we are doing is creating a dummy JSON response And using this fulfill method, we are mocking the response that you'd normally get from this API endpoint. So it will try to make a request to this, and Playwright will intercept the request and just manually pass this hard-coded response to the test. And for the post request, we have a very similar setup. When the front-end app is trying to make a request to this endpoint, this is the hard-coded response that Playwright is going to pass to the test. So once we add these two at the top of our test, now let me run the dev server. So I believe we already have one running here. Yes. And let me also run the test in UI mode this time. So UI, you'll see here that the backend app is not running. We have shut down the backend server. So now let's go to the Playwright test console. I'll go to the test that we just created and I'll run it. So you see that these two ran right at the beginning of the test, and then we go through the same flow. Here, somewhere there will be a fulfill. Yeah, you can see here that we have this route fulfill. So when I click on login and get to this new route, you'll see that we have this dummy task added here, which is coming from the mock response that we set for the to-dos API endpoint. Then when I create a new task and I click on the add to-do button, you'll see that it also gets added to this list, which again is coming from the mock response that we created for the post request. So that's essentially how you'd mock API requests in your Playwright tests. Now, while we are here, and also now that we have the APIs with us, why not take a look at how API tests work? So it's actually much easier this time. So what I'll do is I'll create a new group for this. We had this group here. I'll create a new group and I'll call it API tests. Let's create the first test. Just like we have access to a page object, we also get the request object out of the box. So here we were able to access the page fixture, but since we are not running it on a browser instance, we don't really need the page here. So this time we'll use the request object. This object is an instance of the API request context object that will help us in triggering the API endpoints. The test to fetch the to-dos is pretty straightforward again. There's not much to it. So what I do here is firstly I check the API response, whether it's successful or not. Then inside the to-dos property of the response, I'll check if there's a task that we have in our database. So this is a task that we have hard-coded in our database. So I check whether this exists in the list. And if it does exist, that means our test to get the to-do items passed successfully. The test for a post request is again pretty straightforward. It's actually split into two parts. The first part is where we make the actual post request. The second part is exactly the same as we have in our first test. We fetch the to-dos and check if the added to-do item exists inside the list. That's basically how you test your APIs. Delete and put requests will also go along the same lines. So let me just run these two tests. I believe we already have the UI mode on, so I can directly go to the test console and let me reload this. You'll see the API tests here. I'll run both of these tests and ideally both of these should work. Let me see what's wrong here. Oh, I actually don't have the backend server running. Let me start the server and I'll go back to the console. Now let me run these tests. Yeah, you can see that both of these work and you can see the individual steps executed by these tests. So yeah, this is pretty much the final video of the crash course. Make sure you give the docs a read after you go through the series because there's a lot of information in there that could be helpful for you when you write your own tests. So yeah, do subscribe to the channel to see more of such content and I'll see you in the next one.